I think the next 18 months, 2 years is critical, partially for what Europe can do to rearm, remilitarize. Some of the policies the French and the Germans have been attempting to introduce with this voluntary conscription, but also the idea of a broader independent European sphere of the NATO alliance could be interesting in their ability to support Ukraine. But at the same time, obviously, the longer the war drags on, the more beneficial that is for Moscow, I think. And so could we actually see them pushing along towards Odessa? I find that hard to believe in current circumstances.
That's right. Now, crossing the river, crossing the Dnipro is very, very difficult. But, if you have a Ukrainian force collapse, then a lot of things become possible. Do I think that's likely? No, I don't. But, anything can happen. But I don't think that this war will drag on past 2027, at least at this level of intensity. I think both sides are reaching the point of exhaustion economically and militarily. We're reaching the point where this war will drag on longer than World War I, right? So this has gone very long time, enormous casualties. It's just not sustainable for another decade or 5 years even.
This is The Global Gambit.
All right, welcome back to part two, everyone, with my fabulous guest, Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Part one, we were talking about the national security strategy of America, Europe a little bit, China, Trump's mindset, the usual shebang. But as usual, I like to knuckle down with Dmitri and get into the sort of strategic and then tactical, the military dynamics of the war in Ukraine, because it deserves its own, I think, focused discussion point. So, Dmitri, we've seen a lot of developments in the past few months over peace, over, I don't know, the diplomatic angle, but of course, obviously, Russia's pushes towards Pokrovsk, and now Zelensky's appearance in Kupiansk, and, well, there's a lot of things that I want to unpack with you. Very simply, to get started, how do you look at the broader situation in the war in Ukraine on the Eastern Front, Ukraine's strikes into Russia and so on?
I think it's quite precarious right now. And again, like we might be entering one of the most difficult phases of this war for Ukraine. One, the Russians have finally figured out how to target Ukrainian energy infrastructure with much greater effect. And you're now seeing continued sustained blackouts in major cities across Ukraine as we're entering what will probably be quite a cold winter. You're seeing the Russians have the initiatives largely across almost the entire front. In Pokrovsk, obviously, in the Khalupale axis. In Kupiansk, the Ukrainians have had a tactical counterattack that have pushed back the Russians, and President Zelensky recently visited it, despite the proclamations from Defense Minister Belousov to Putin that Kupiansk is taken. But look, the Russians have a huge advantage in manpower. The Ukrainians have not fixed the one issue that I think we've talked about for years now, manpower, right? Training, recruitment of personnel still is abysmal in Ukraine, and that is the number one reason why they're losing territory to such a great extent. On the drone front, the Russians now have a tactical advantage as well, right? So they've mobilized their industry very, very effectively to outproduce the Ukrainians, to standardize on certain drone systems, which the Ukrainians still have not done because individual units kind of procure separately. So you don't have standardization of systems across the front like you have on the Russian side. And volume matters, right? And because largely they have such limited manpower, you basically have, across this entire front line, very few people actually manning it, right? You may have a kilometer of front line where you only have a few pockets of, 3-4 people in the trench manning it at any given point in time. And you now have seen the Russians develop these tactics of individual unit infiltrations, company-size infiltrations to get deep behind the enemy lines, Ukrainian lines, and an attack from the rear. They lose a lot of people doing that. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians now feel like, oh my God, we don't even know where the front line is, right? It's sort of easy to see on the map. It gets published on social media, the color codes where the front line is, but it actually does not represent reality because the front line is so porous and there are units on both sides that are kind of infiltrating in different directions. And that makes it a very dynamic battlefield, but one that is largely defined by how much manpower you have. And the Russians are still out recruiting the Ukrainians and raising bonuses for signups, now going beyond just recruiting from prisons to recruiting people that are simply getting arrested, and right at the investigative stage of the arrest, they're being given a contract to sign to be sent to Ukraine, so that they don't have to go to trial and risk going to jail. So they're able to still compensate for their problems by throwing people at it and suffering enormous casualties, right, by any measure, but nevertheless gaining territory. And things are going to be continually tough for Ukraine unless they solve this manpower issue. You know, they have people. That's not the issue. They're not willing to conscript them. They're not willing to conscript the young people. The fact that Zelensky opened up the borders for young people to leave the country, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them were able to flee in the last couple of months, is just mind-boggling. Why would you ever do that when you're at war and you need personnel, right? So they're just not making strategically the right decisions when it comes to fighting this war. The one bright spot is on deep strike, right? We've talked about this for years. I've always believed that if you want to put pressure on Russia, you have to strike Russia, you have to strike deeply, you have to strike in Moscow, you have to strike in St. Petersburg. They're not quite there yet, except for the drone strikes, but their missile strikes are getting more powerful. The Flamingos and other systems that they're building are able to inflict some real damage. They need to extend that range because it matters a lot less what happens in Crimea than what happens in Moscow. So they need to develop cruise missiles that can target Moscow with significant payloads, so that you can at least, at a minimum, establish a sort of truce where, you know, we won't hit your energy systems if you don't hit ours, similar to what they had done early on in the Black Sea with a truce that took place there a couple of years ago. You desperately need that to put pressure on the Russians. But at the end of the day, on the battlefield, you need more men, and they have not shown the willingness to make the hard political decisions that are necessary to fix that issue.
Well, I wanted to be devil's advocate for a couple of questions, although you've somewhat addressed them. One of them is simply about this innovation aspect, because the Ukrainians have been remarkable in being able to do quite a lot with quite little, but it's not a effective compensation for the manpower element. If the Ukrainians can continue to upscale their deep strike capabilities, if that's the way to put it, do you think that that could be enough of a or issue for the Russians? I think most people agree that the war is not going to be won necessarily, at least in the short term, directly on the battlefield. It's more about whether the Ukrainian support disintegrates or the Russian economy is in a bad shape. What's your sort of longer term assessment of the Ukrainians' capacity to disrupt Russia's war machine from inside, if that makes sense?
Yeah, they're doing good work there. Much more needs to be done, but it is possible. And you know, things are not going well on the Russian side either. And things are getting particularly dire right now with the oil prices dropping. The price of the Urals, the type of oil that Russia sells, is now below $50, which is not a price at which they can really significantly bring money into the Russian budget to pay off for all this military spending. Their national wealth fund is depleting, particularly the liquid assets in that national fund are depleting. That's what they use mostly to finance this war up to this point. So the chickens are coming to roost in many ways. The economy is still not in great shape. Inflation is high. Interest rates continue to persist. There's a labor shortage because of the war. And the civilian economy in particular is in really, really dire straits. You know, you look at the overall GDP and you say, oh, things look quite fine, but it's not a productive GDP because it's the military production is such a high percentage now of the Russian economy, and of course it's producing weapon systems that are getting immediately destroyed in Ukraine. That's not something that is incredibly valuable, right, from an economic perspective. But things like the automotive industry, the factories producing even shoes and other commodities are going out of business or in really dire shapes because of the high interest rates, because of the low labor market. That is all not sustainable. Having said that, Russia is not about to collapse, despite the fact that the choices are getting harder and harder for Putin. He's still able to sort of do these machinations, and particularly relying on his really impressive economic team, and particularly central banker Elvira Nabiullina, who is probably one of the best central bankers in modern history in terms of the hat tricks that she's been able to pull off, keeping the Russian economy afloat. But, you know, increasingly you run out of tricks. And I think that in 18 months or so, the pressures are going to be so immense that it'll be difficult to continue this war. But he's not about to end it now, which is why I don't think any of these peace negotiations are going anywhere, because he feels like he's got the initiative right now. He's taking territory. Now, he thinks he's taking more territory than he really is, because the military is reporting to him things like, we've taken Kupiansk, when it really hasn't happened. But nevertheless, there is real progress there. He knows that things are really tough for Zelensky politically. He had to let go of Yermak, one of his longtime advisors, just recently. There's more opposition to him. He's getting squeezed by President Trump as well. So, if you're Putin right now, why would you negotiate when you think you can still get the whole enchilada? Because who knows, the Zelensky regime may collapse. You may have the civil war in Ukraine. From his perspective, I don't think any of this is likely to happen. But Putin, I think, certainly believes that. And, why would you settle for something less than what you think you can accomplish on the battlefield? Now, in 18 months, I think the situation could be quite different, and he may be much more ready to negotiate given the pressures in the Russian economy, but he's not there yet. And of course, Ukraine needs to survive for 18 months before we get to that point.
It does. I did want to ask you a little bit more on that in a second, but a follow-up to this is there's always been this debate, I think, or speculation, perhaps a better word, about Putin's intricate knowledge of the battlefield. And there was a briefing that was given to him by the chief of the general staff of Russia's armed forces, Valery Gerasimov. And they were sort of showing maps that didn't depict the reality, showing that Russia had full control of, say, Kupiansk when Zelensky was there, just 5 days ago? Is that not a bit of a problem if the Russian military arm are not giving Putin as explicit, details as possible, even if he doesn't like them?
Yeah, well, I think that's been the case since the very start of this war, when he had unrealistic expectations of what would be accomplished, fed by the military that was telling him that this would be all done. Now, eventually, you sort of do get to the point where reality intervenes, and that's what happened in April of 2022 when they had to withdraw from the Battle of Kiev and Kharkiv and other areas. He presented it as given room to negotiations, but the reality was that the Russian military could not sustain itself in that offensive and had to withdraw. But so occasionally you do have people coming to him and presenting the reality that is unavoidable. But until you get to that dire point, they're going to push good news up because he probably does not handle bad news well. And if you want to get promoted, you should not be a deliverer of bad news. So that is absolutely part of the problem, is that he probably has unrealistic expectations of how far he can get with his military force, and that's what is driving him to keep at it.
Yeah. Now, to flip it on its head, we've discussed a little bit about the Ukrainians' ability to hold out. 18 months, I think, is a fair time frame. Also, because by that point we'll have the midterms in the US, which could be a problem for Trump's ability to exert power in this way. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But on the Ukrainian aspect, obviously those revelations around the internal corruption, which I don't think should surprise anyone given Ukraine's history. But what did you make of those, and how much do you think that will be a reoccurring problem in the months ahead?
Well, there is a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and you've seen that obviously through the years, both of this war and long before it. So I don't think it's at all surprising. There's also the reemergence of the political battle lines that you're seeing in Ukraine. You have Zelensky that I think clearly wants to run for president at some point, trying to push his own narrative about where the country should be going. You have others in the Rada and elsewhere that are sort of making their own political moves quietly still, and mostly not extremely visible. But nevertheless, it's very, very different from where things were back in 2022, because everyone sort of realizes that at some point there will be an election, perhaps sooner than later, and that's when you have an opportunity to challenge Zelensky, who has become much weaker as the war progressed and more politically isolated, and there's an opportunity for others to reemerge to challenge him. So, yeah, there's a lot of dynamic activity happening on the Ukrainian side as well. And some people, frankly, that are emerging, some like former advisors to Zelensky, they're saying, you know what, we need to get a peace deal now because we cannot sustain this war, even if it's a bad peace deal. Not everyone, and the vast majority of the Ukrainians are not yet willing to go there, but the fact that these voices are emerging now is interesting, because that certainly was not the case even a couple of years ago.
What do you think that they should? let's just be blunt about it. A lot of people who are more sympathetic to Russia emphasize that it was the West, or Boris Johnson, when he went in early 20, part of the war in 22, to encourage Ukraine not to accept any peace terms back then. Do you think that this is something that Ukraine should do for the sake of its own long-term stability and interests?
Look, I haven't made any really public comments on the 28-point plan, largely because I think it's irrelevant. And largely it's irrelevant not because, Ukrainians might accept them or not accept them and how those terms might look to the Ukrainians, but because the Russians will never accept them. There's been all this commentary of like, this is a Russian plan. This is not a Russian plan. There might be some points from Russia in the plan, but this clearly is not the plan that was drafted for the Russians. Do you think the Russians want Donald Trump to be the sole chairman of the peace council post the end of the war? Absolutely not. Putin would never accept that. Do you think the Russians want half of their central bank reserves that are right now locked up in Brussels to be used to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and the Europeans contributing half, and the Americans getting half of the profits? You think the Russians would ever agree to that? Absolutely not. This debate about 600,000 forces that the Ukrainians would be capped at, 500,000, whatever it is, and whether it's enough or not is irrelevant because the Russians would never accept anything even close to that number. So it's just not a peace plan that I think has any chance of working because the Russians are not there yet. They're not willing to concede that they can't get much more on the battlefield, and Putin's going to keep going. So, if Putin were willing to make concessions, we could discuss about whether it's smart or not for the Ukrainians to take them, but he's not going to do that for another 12 to 18 months minimum.
So when we then hear the comments from Putin that he said just yesterday or in the past week over what little swine and Europe's, clearly does that not demonstrate that he's frustrated? He's frustrated that while he's winning the US administration round, or bringing them round perhaps, but Europe is not. Is that not a demonstration that he's irritated by them, that not all is good in the Kremlin? Focusing
No,
on
I think it's an expression of his contempt for Europe. I don't think it matters. I think he feels like the only people that he needs to talk to is Washington, and everyone else is irrelevant, including Kiev and including Europe.
But if they're relevant, why is he getting so irritated by their actions over the assets or whether or not they follow through? I appreciate your comments from before, but clearly he's having to recalculate. If Europe is going to deviate away from, I don't know, US strategy and NATO more broadly and do their own thing, or attempt to at least, is he not going to have to try to accept acknowledging them as a player?
Well, if they actually deliver on the plans that have been talked about and actually are funding a massive rearmament campaign on Russian borders, then yes, I think he'll start paying attention. I don't know that he actually believes that that's going to happen. His view is, very much a great power view. There's America, China, and Russia, and everyone else is irrelevant. And if he needs to have concessions from Europe, he'll count on Donald Trump to deliver them. Now, that may not be reality, and but that's how he sees the world.
Fair enough. All right. So I did want to ask you a couple of questions about his objectives, right? Because from my perspective, I've always believed that if he couldn't not physically occupy all of Ukraine, but at least influence the sort of a bit for Ukraine to be like a Belarus 2.0, he would like to forcibly take much of Northern right? This whole idea of what Katerina the Great conquered in the 1700s, 1800s, whenever it was, all the way from southern Ukraine to Odessa, linking up with Transnistria. Do you think that that's what he's still after, based on his comments yesterday, but also going back through everything he's ever said?
Well, look, war objectives are always adjustable based on what is available to you, right? And I think when he started this war, the objective was get into Kiev, change the government there, and put someone in place that is basically a puppet regime that he could control, right? Since then, when things started going badly for him, I think he readjusted to let's just take the Donbass, right? At least I can claim that, I've taken a big chunk of territory that helps me ensure a land bridge to Crimea and has resources there and has this historical attachment for Russia. As things started going better for him and in the last year in particular, I think he's sort of thinking, well, why not Odessa? Why not Kherson? Why not these other places? So based on how things are going well or not well, or how he, more importantly, perceives them to go, I think that that appetite will grow or shrink. So I don't think he's particularly set on a specific outcome here. It's much more dynamic than that. And yes, if he could, he'd take all of Ukraine, right? If he can't take all of it, he'd like to take the Black Sea coast. He'd like to take, all of the Novorossiya, which, by the way, is a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory, not just the Donbass, not just the Black Sea coast. It's Mykolaiv, it's central Ukraine. So you've got an enormous chunk of Ukraine that would technically fall under Russian territory that, frankly, they have no ability to seize militarily today. So it's very much a dreaming scenario at the moment. But depending on how things unfold, he's going to adjust his aim.
I think the next 18 months, 2 years is critical, partially for what Europe can do to rearm, remilitarize. Some of the policies the French and the Germans have been attempting to introduce with this voluntary conscription, but also the idea of a broader independent European sphere of the NATO alliance. It could be interesting in their ability to support Ukraine. But at the same time, obviously, the longer the war drags on, the more beneficial that is for Moscow, I think. And so could we actually see them pushing along towards Odessa? I find that hard to believe in the current circumstances.
That's right. Now, crossing the river, crossing the Dnipro is very, very difficult. But, if you have a Ukrainian force collapse, then a lot of things become possible. Do I think that's likely? No, I don't. But, anything can happen. But I don't think that this war will drag on past 2027, at least in this intense, at this level of intensity. I think both sides are reaching the point of exhaustion economically and militarily. So, we're reaching the point where this war will drag on longer than World War I, right? So this is gone very long time, enormous casualties. It's just not sustainable for, another decade or 5 years even. I think it's a much, much shorter time period, but we have to get there. Ukrainians in particular are going to need a lot of support from Europe, weapons, but more importantly, cash that can go directly to Ukraine and cash that can be used to purchase American weapons that the Europeans can supply themselves. And hopefully that continues.
Well, one theory that I've seen floated around is the idea that Ukraine sort of takes stock of what it is right now, accepts the lines as they are, but then over the next few years, if Europe again enters this new reality and steps up effectively, not just through words, but action, that Ukraine, if militarized correctly enough with the right support, could sort of attempt to retake the territories that were lost. Is that preposterous as a scenario?
It is preposterous because the Russians won't accept it, right? Ukrainians would take a ceasefire at this moment, right? If you could freeze the lines, they could get a breather, they could rebuild some of their infrastructure, they could build more capacity for deep strike, right? Build more of these flamingos and other long-range strike weapons. They would love to do that. For that very reason, Putin won't let them. He is rejecting a ceasefire because he's in the offensive. He's said openly, why would I give Ukrainians a breather right now, right? I don't want to do that. They're under pressure. I'm going to keep the pressure on. So all of these plans are just completely unrealistic because they ignore the most important factor, which is Moscow. And Moscow does not want a deal right now unless it's a surrender deal that the Ukrainians are not willing to obviously give them.
So then what is most realistic? As we wrap up for our extensive conversation, Dmitri, what would you most expect or encourage people to watch out for?
I think the most realistic scenario is a status quo where the war continues, the fighting continues, the Russians will gain some territory at enormous cost. Hopefully the Ukrainians will keep the lines together and there won't be a collapse. And they're going to build up more of these deep strike systems to put more pressure on the Russian economy and Russian cities and Russian energy grid to try to relieve the pressure on their own in some sort of limited truce on energy strikes, for example. That's, I think, the most likely scenario for another 12 to 18 months. And then we'll see how the situation unfolds on the battlefield, whether Putin feels a lot more realistic about his prospects for keeping on, and whether he might come to the negotiation table with real concessions, which he's not willing to do today.
But that makes me wonder, though, if the Ukraine does it in such a way which is so effective, we reach a critical juncture by which they force the Russian economy into a really bad way, couldn't that create a snowball effect? Right, we've seen periods in warfare where things are just dragging on, it's relatively attritional, and then suddenly there's one shock event or inflection point which creates a whole multitude of effects that no one really anticipated.
Absolutely. I mean, wars are very difficult to predict, right? A lot can happen on the Russian side, a lot can happen on the Ukrainian side that we can't really predict at the moment, particularly very far out. And look, as I said, even if nothing else changes, I think in 18 months, Putin is going to have some really, really tough choices in terms of his own economic ability to keep this thing going. But, you know, the Ukrainians could potentially accelerate that if they develop sufficient deep strike capacities. There are things that they can do to bring the war to an end faster than it would naturally. I wish they had done a lot of this stuff early on. I wish, you know, we talked about this a long time ago. A lot of this deep strike capability. Look, if the Iranians can build tons of ballistic missiles, I don't understand why the Ukrainians can't, right? Of course they can. They got the industrial base, they've got the people, they've got the talent. They may need more cash, but even the Iranians are not like in a great economic shape, right? They just have not prioritized that issue. Now, obviously, they also had other expenditures like on the war itself that the Iranians don't have. So I understand that things are challenging, but nevertheless, you know, this is probably one of the most strategic things they could have done. They're doing it now, but boy, I wish they had started back in 2022.
A cold set of hard truths there, uncomfortable realities there from Dmitri Alperovitch. Thank you very much, as always, for joining the Global Gambit. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you all next time as well. Take care, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon.
Thank you.